The pyramids of Egypt, just thinking about them, it sparks so many questions, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you're like me, you've always wanted to really understand how these incredible things were built, but maybe without getting too bogged down in, super academic stuff.
Right. You want the core story.
Exactly. So that's what we're doing right now.
Welcome to this deep dive.
Mhm.
We're getting into the construction, the context, basically everything around the Egyptian pyramids.
And our main guide for this is the complete pyramids.
Yeah.
Which is, well, it's pretty comprehensive.
It really is. It pulls together archaeology, historical accounts, different theories. It's all in there. And our job is to sort of pull out the most fascinating bits for you.
Yeah, consider this your fast track. We've done the sifting, so you get the really captivating stuff, the details that, give you a real sense of it all.
Okay, so where do we start? It's such a huge topic.
Good question. Maybe set the scene. Like, what was Egypt like back then?
Good idea.
Mm-hmm.
To really get the pyramids, you have to picture the world they came from. So the ancient Egypt, Old Kingdom era, that's when the really big ones went up.
Right.
Now, Egypt today has, what, over 100 million people? Back then, the estimate for the whole country, maybe 1.6 million.
Wait, only 1.6 million?
Roughly, yeah. During the Old Kingdom peak.
Wow. That's tiny compared to the scale of the pyramids. How did they manage that?
It shows an incredible level of organization, doesn't it? Resource management, societal structure. It had to be highly sophisticated.
So where were these 1.6 million people actually living? Were they spread out?
Mostly concentrated in two main spots. You had the Luxor and Aswan area, way down south.
Okay.
And then another band stretching north from around Midim, near the Fayum, up towards the Delta. Middle Egypt, the bit in between, was less dense, sort of a bridge between the two.
And the pyramid sites, Giza, Saqqara, they weren't necessarily right in those population centers.
Not always, no. Which brings up the logistics. How do you get food, materials, people to these massive construction zones?
Yeah.
Well, there was a system. Estates, farms, mainly in Middle Egypt and the Delta, were funneling resources, food, supplies to the pyramid sites.
So like a supply chain?
A very ancient, but clearly effective supply chain. The planning involved is pretty remarkable for the time.
And when we say pyramid, we usually just picture that big triangle shape. But it was more than that, wasn't it?
Oh, much more. What we see is just the main part of what's called a standard pyramid complex.
Standard pyramid complex, okay.
Yeah, so you have the pyramid itself, sure, that covers the burial chambers underneath, the substructure. But then you also have the superstructure, the buildings above ground.
For what? Offerings.
Exactly. Offerings, rituals for the dead king. Typically, you'd find a valley temple down near the Nile.
Right, where the processions might start.
Probably. Then a causeway, like a covered walkway leading up the plateau.
Okay.
And that connects to a mortuary temple right against the east side of the pyramid usually. Plus, sometimes smaller pyramids nearby, maybe for queens or officials.
Got it. So it's a whole interconnected site. Okay, we've got the setting. What about when this all happened and who was driving it? The timeline feels complicated.
It is complicated.
Yeah.
Egyptian chronology is something scholars are always refining, debating.
Always finding new bits of evidence.
Exactly. But the source we're using leans heavily on work by John Baines and Jeremiah Malik, which gives us a solid framework.
Okay.
So we're talking a huge span. Things start way back in the late pre-dynastic, around 3000 BC, then the early dynastic period.
And that's when pyramid building really kicks off.
It leads into it. The Old Kingdom, starting around, say, 2575 BC, that's the main event for the giants, especially the Fourth Dynasty.
Ah, the famous names.
Yes. You've got Sneferu, who kind of experimented, built a few different types. Then his son, Khufu.
The Great Pyramid.
The big one. Then Djedefre, then Khafre. He's often linked with the Sphinx.
Right.
And Menkaure, the builder of the third, smaller Giza pyramid. Those Fourth Dynasty guys are key for the most iconic ones.
Definitely the ones everyone knows.
Yeah.
But it didn't just stop dead after them, right?
No, not at all. Pyramid building continued, though the style and scale changed. You get Middle Kingdom pharaohs building pyramids like Senbumsret III, Amenemhet III.
Using different techniques sometimes.
Yeah, we'll get into that.
Yeah.
Mud brick cores became more common later, and even into the 13th dynasty, you have pharaohs like Khedr still building them. It's a long tradition.
Okay. Now, with something this old, this massive, myths are bound to pop up.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think the biggest one you still hear all the time, is about who actually built them. The slaves' idea.
That's a really crucial point to clear up. The popular image, often from movies, is, Hebrew slaves dragging blocks under the lash.
Right.
But the main Old Kingdom pyramids, Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure, were built more than 1,000 years before the time the Bible places the Exodus.
1,000 years, that's a massive gap.
It completely disconnects the two events chronologically. So that narrative just doesn't fit the historical timeline for these pyramids.
So where did that idea even come from then, if it's so wrong?
It's complicated, but a big factor was losing the ability to read the original writing.
The hieroglyphs.
Exactly. Over centuries, the Egyptian language shifted, eventually adopting Coptic script, which uses Greek letters. By around the 4th century AD, maybe a bit later, nobody could really read the ancient hieroglyphs anymore.
So the actual records, the inscriptions on the monuments, became mysteries.
Pretty much. The knowledge of who built them, why, the details, it faded. And into that vacuum stepped myths, legends, later interpretations.
And stories just fill in the gaps.
Precisely. You even get Roman writers like Strabo talking about movable stone entrance in the Great Pyramid. Is that real? A later modification? Who knows? But it shows the mystery was already building.
And what about that story of the Caliph al-Mamun breaking in? That sounds like pure adventure fiction.
It has that flavor, definitely.
The
The legend goes, around 820 AD, Caliph al-Mamun wanted treasure, so he supposedly forced his way into Khufu's pyramid.
Using acid and fire, wasn't that part of the story?
Something like that, yeah. Battering rams.
Yeah.
Very dramatic. And supposedly he found, emerald statues, indestructible glass, a golden coffin.
Did he? Did they actually find anything, or is it just legend?
All the accounts are really dubious. There is an entrance tunnel, the one tourists use now, often called Memon's Hole. But whether his men actually dug it or just found an older tomb robber's tunnel, debated.
Ah.
And the descriptions of the finds, mechanical birds, magic vases. It sounds very much like later embellishments. Some accounts from the time even suggest they found it already open. So, probably more legend than fact.
Amazing how stories grew over time. Okay, let's jump forward. When did people start looking at these things more? Systematically, less treasure hunt, more study.
Key figure is John Greaves in the 17th century. He was an Oxford astronomy professor.
An astronomer studying pyramids.
Yeah. He approached it scientifically for his time, read the classical sources, then went to Egypt himself to measure things.
What did he figure out?
He mostly dismissed the wilder theories about who built them. Based on Herodotus and others, he correctly identified Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, and he recognized they were tombs.
So, moving towards the truth.
Definitely. His book, Pyramidographia, had the first kind of measured cross-section of the Great Pyramid. Not perfectly accurate by our standards, but a huge step.
Did he notice things like the missing stones?
Yes, he noted the outer casing was gone, stripped away. He explored inside, the passages, the king's chamber. He even mentioned the pavement on the east side, which hinted at the mortuary temple. He was laying groundwork.
Solid work. Who came next, building on that?
Early 18th century, you get Benoit de Maillet, the French consul general. He visited Khufu's pyramid multiple times.
More measurements.
Some, maybe less precise than Greaves in areas, but his drawings of the inside passages were actually a bit better. And he noted the second pyramid, Khafre's, had lost most of its casing too by then.
So things were changing even then.
Right. And de Maillet even had this idea for a massive survey of all Egyptian sites, kind of foreshadowing Napoleon's big expedition later on.
In Davison's chamber. That sounds important.
Very. 1765. Nathaniel Davison, a British diplomat, found this lowest stress-relieving chamber right above the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid.
Ow.
Climbed up through a small hole at the top of the Grand Gallery. It was a crucial discovery for understanding the engineering, how they handled the massive weight overhead.
Each discovery adding a piece to the puzzle. What about later in the 18th century?
You had travelers like Richard Pocock and Frederick Norden. They visited around the same time, 1737.
Did they add much?
Pocock's map of Giza was a bit basic, and he made some mistakes, like thinking some later arches were part of Khufu's causeway.
Whoops.
But Norden was a naval captain and a skilled artist. His drawings in his travels were much more accurate. He captured the state of the monuments, including the Sphinx with its damaged nose, really well. His artist's eye was key.
Okay, so we're getting better visuals, better measurements. Then Napoleon arrives. That must have been a game changer.
The huge moment. Napoleon brought a whole commission. Scientists, engineers, artists. Their work resulted in the Description de l'Égypte.
That multi-volume masterpiece.
Exactly. Filled with detailed drawings, plans, elevations of the pyramids, the Sphinx, everything. It set a new standard for scientific recording.
But wasn't that also a time of Less careful digging?
Unfortunately, yes. The early 19th century saw a lot of excavation driven by collecting, frankly, plunder.
Yeah.
Figures like Belzoni.
Right, the strongman explored.
Yeah. He funded his own digs, found Khafre's upper entrance in 1818, which was unknown.
Yeah.
But he also found an Arabic inscription inside showing it had been opened centuries before.
Interesting. And Cavillia.
He worked around the Sphinx, did the first big clearance of sand around it, uncovering that chapel between his paws. But again, often focused on finding objects.
Then Howard Vyse, he sounds forceful.
Yes, one word for it.
Yeah.
He was determined to get inside Menkaur's pyramid. And he used gunpowder.
Gunpowder. Seriously.
Yes. Blasted his way in. Very controversial, obviously destructive.
But did it achieve anything useful?
Ironically, yes. Inside the burial chamber, they found quarry marks, graffiti essentially, painted on the ceiling blocks that included Menkaur's name.
Ah, so that confirmed it was his pyramid.
Exactly. Destructive method, but crucial confirmation.
Okay. And then Lepsius, his work seems more scholarly.
Immensely so. Carl Richard Lepsius, mid-19th century. His Denkmäler was another monumental recording project, just incredibly detailed documentation of monuments across Egypt and Nubia.
Focusing on pyramids, too.
Absolutely. Detailed plans, elevations. He also did important work at Saqqara, at the Step Pyramid, finding inscriptions naming Djoser.
Did he have theories about construction?
He did. He proposed the accretion theory, the idea that pyramids grew layer by layer as a pharaoh reigned, so bigger pyramid meant longer reign.
Is that accepted now?
No, it's been largely discredited.
Yeah.
But this recording work was invaluable, a massive contribution to Egyptology.
Okay, so we've gone from myths to gunpowder to meticulous recording. Let's get to the how. How did they actually build these things? Starting with the stone, where did it all come from?
Right, the materials. The core of the pyramids was often local limestone, quarried right there on the Giza Plateau, for example.
Okay, the rough stuff inside.
Yeah, but the really fine white limestone for the smooth outer casing, that came from quarries across the river at Tura.
How did they get it out?
These were often deep underground galleries. Workers tunneled in, following the best seams of stone, cutting it out in layers or terraces. Huge amounts were needed just for Khufu's casing alone.
And the granite, that really hard reddish stone you see inside?
That came all the way from Aswan, hundreds of miles south.
Wow. What was that used for?
Lining burial chambers like in Khufu's pyramid, making massive portcullis blocks to seal passages, also for pillars and other elements in the temples.
Some people used to think they just used, like, naturally found granite boulders, right? Because it was so hard to work.
That was an older idea.
Yeah.
But when you look at the size and precision, those huge roof slabs in the king's chamber, for instance, it's clear they were quarrying it and shaping it very deliberately, not just picking up rocks.
How on earth did they cut granite back then? With copper tools?
Copper probably wasn't hard enough for the main work on granite. The source suggests they used heavy pounders made of dolerite.
Dolerite.
Another very hard igneous rock, almost as tough as granite. They basically use these to hammer and bash the granite into shape.
Just brute force pounding.
Seems like it. Archaeologists find lots of these dolerite pounders in the Aswan quarries. And you can see evidence on unfinished blocks, pounding marks, channels bashed out to help split the blocks free. Incredibly laborious.
Unbelievable effort. Okay, they've quarried the stone. How do they move these giant blocks weighing tons, sometimes for miles?
Transportation was another huge challenge. The best guess, strongly supported by evidence, is sledges.
Wooden sledges.
Yes, dragged by large teams of workers. And to make it easier, they likely lubricated the path, maybe pouring water onto clay or sand in front of the sledge runners to reduce friction. There was that no VA experiment years ago.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. They moved a big block that way.
Exactly. And we find evidence like ancient embankments, trackways near quarries that look like they were built for hauling heavy loads on sledges.
Okay, sledges work on the flat. But how do you get a multi-ton block up the side of a growing pyramid? The ramp question.
Ah, yes, the ramp debate. Everyone agrees ramps were involved. The question is, what kind of ramp?
A single, massive, straight-on ramp seems impractical.
Hugely impractical.
Yeah.
As the pyramid gets taller, the ramp needs to get incredibly long to maintain a workable slope. Some calculations suggest the ramp would end up bigger than the pyramid itself.
So what are the other ideas?
Well, maybe zigzag ramps going up one face, or ramps built around the corners.
What about internal ramps inside the pyramid?
That's been suggested, especially by Jean-Pierre Houdin. But finding clear archaeological proof for large internal ramps within the main structure of the big pyramids is tricky.
Any other possibilities?
Another idea is ramps that sort of hug the face of the pyramid as it went up. maybe shorter ramps, moving position as needed, perhaps resting on the layers of stone.
Is there anything that supports that?
Interestingly, some recent work found that the unfinished casing stones at the base of Khufu's Queen's pyramids stick out quite a bit.
Like ledges?
Yeah, and those could potentially have been used to support or anchor ramps running along the face. It's an intriguing possibility.
Okay, so ramps of some kind. How did they keep the angle right, making sure all four sides met perfectly at the top? That seems like incredibly precise surveying.
They were masters of practical geometry. They used a measurement called the seeked.
Seeked.
Yeah, it basically defined the slope as a ratio, so many palms and fingers of horizontal distance for every cubit of vertical rise.
Like rise over run.
Exactly. By keeping that seek consistent for each course of stones, they control the angle very precisely.
How did they check it on the actual blocks?
Evidence suggests they might have marked guidelines right onto the casing stones before they were put in place, showing the correct angle of the face, so the masons could trim them precisely.
Wow. And keeping the whole thing aligned, the corners pointing correctly.
Probably using simple but effective methods, maybe plumb bobs for vertical lines, and perhaps sighting markers set up at a distance on the desert floor to keep the main axes and diagonals aligned as the structure grew higher.
Amazing precision with simple tools. What about the inside? Was it just solid rock behind the casing?
Not always perfectly solid. The core was often built with less perfectly shaped blocks, sometimes local limestone, with gaps filled in with smaller stones, rubble, even gypsum mortar sometimes.
So not quite as neat inside as outside.
Generally, no. And we see different techniques. Some of Khufu's smaller pyramids seem to have stepped inner cores, built up in layers.
And didn't you mention mud brick later?
Yes. In the Middle Kingdom, that became a common technique. They'd build a core of mud brick, but often reinforce it with an internal grid of stone walls, or ribs.
Yeah.
Semosreno's pyramid is a key example of this innovation.
Right, materials, methods. What about the people? Who were these workers? Was it really slaves?
No, that's the persistent myth, but the archaeological evidence points elsewhere. We find evidence of a well-organized Egyptian workforce.
How organized?
They were divided into large crews, which the Egyptians called za, or philae. These often had names like the Great Gang, or the Green Gang, or the Vigorous Gang.
Gangs, like work teams.
Exactly. And these big gangs were subdivided into smaller divisions, maybe around 200 men, and then even smaller groups of perhaps 20.
So a hierarchy of labor. Any idea how many people were actually working on, say, the Great Pyramid at any one time?
Calculations based on moving and setting stones suggest maybe two main crews, perhaps around 2,000 men each, doing the heavy lifting and construction.
Okay, 4,000, that's a lot, but it's not the hundreds of thousands you sometimes hear about.
Right, but that's just the core construction crew. You needed many other specialists.
Like who?
Quarrymen, obviously, haulers, stone setters, but also carpenters for sledges and tools, metal workers for sharpening copper chisels, potters for jars, water carriers.
Makers, brewers?
Absolutely. People to feed and supply everyone. When you add in all the support staff, the total workforce involved for something like Khufu's pyramid might have swelled to 20,000, maybe even 25,000 people at peak times. It was a huge logistical operation.
A temporary city, almost. And speaking of cities, these pyramids weren't just isolated monuments, were they? There were settlements nearby.
Definitely. Each major pyramid had its own pyramid town nearby.
What were these towns for?
They housed the priests who maintained the cult of the dead king, officials managing the complex, guards, artisans, and all the support staff needed, both during construction and long after, for the rituals.
So they weren't just worker camps that disappeared.
No, many became permanent settlements. In the Old Kingdom, the location of the royal residence, the sort of capital, often shifted depending on where the king was building his pyramid. So these towns were important centers. Memphis was always a major city, but the court might be based near the current project.
We know the names of any of these towns.
Yes, for Giza, we know names like Girgit Khufu, the estate of Khufu, and Genu Khafre, the island of Khafre. They were organized settlements.
Managed by officials.
Initially, maybe by royal princes, later by other high officials who had responsibility for the cult and the town's resources. Some, like the town for Senwosret II at Elahun, grew quite large, housing thousands.
And there might have been other related areas, too, near the floodplain.
Yes, the source mentions the idea of a rashi, possibly a royal precinct or harbor area, the edge of the cultivation, serving as an interface between the pyramid complex up on the plateau and the Nile Valley below.
Has much evidence of these wider settlements been found, beyond the immediate pyramid towns?
Actually, yes. Modern construction projects around Cairo, like the big wastewater project called Ambrick, have uncovered significant evidence of extensive Old Kingdom settlements buried beneath later layers, spreading out from Giza.
What kind of evidence?
Huge amounts of pottery, animal bones, mud brick structures, even hints of potentially large administrative buildings, or maybe even palaces stretching for miles. It suggests the whole area was much more developed than just the plateau itself.
Okay, back to the workforce. Feeding tens of thousands of people. That's a monumental task in itself. How did they do it?
This is where recent archaeology at Giza has been fascinating. They've excavated areas that seem to be specifically for provisioning the workers.
Like what?
There's a site nicknamed the Loaves and Fishes Gallery.
Loaves and fishes. Seriously.
Yeah, because they found evidence of mass bread baking, huge numbers of bell-shaped pottery molds, probably for making large, dense loaves, enough to feed thousands daily.
Wow. And the fish part?
And adjacent areas clearly set up for processing fish on a massive scale, drying, smoking, salting. Mostly Nile catfish and shawl, fish that were plentiful.
So basically an industrial food production zone right there.
It looks like it. A well-organized, possibly seasonal operation geared towards producing and preserving food for the pyramid workforce. It's amazing direct evidence for how they were sustained.
That really brings it to life. It wasn't just about stone, it was about bread and fish, too.
Absolutely. And this ties into concepts like imaku, being provided for or sustained by the king's estate, likely through a system of redistributing resources and offerings.
We've focused a lot on the Old Kingdom giants. You mentioned things changed in the Middle Kingdom. How are those pyramids different?
Yes, significant changes. As we said, many Middle Kingdom pharaohs used a core of mud brick instead of solid stone.
Well, of a change? Quicker? Cheaper?
Possibly a combination. But they had to innovate structurally. Senusret, for example, built this internal framework of stone walls radiating out from the center and cross walls, creating compartments that were then filled with rubble or mud brick. It provided stability.
Clever. Any other differences?
The stonework was generally less precise than the peak Old Kingdom work. So instead of perfect joints, they often used things like wooden dovetail clamps to physically link blocks together.
And the workforce size? Was it smaller?
Estimates for a typical Middle Kingdom mud brick pyramid like Amenemhet III's suggest maybe around 5,000 workers. Still a huge number, but significantly less than the perhaps 20–25,000 peak for Khufu. Reflects the different scale in the materials.
So the ambition was still there, but the methods evolved.
Definitely. It shows continued royal power and organization, but adapting techniques over time. The pyramids remain incredible feats across all these periods.
Well, this has been just incredible. We've gone from the setting, the timeline, the myths, the explorers, right into the nitty-gritty of quarrying, hauling, ramps, and even feeding the workers. It covers a lot of ground.
It really does. And I think the main thing that stands out is these were human achievements. Vast, complex, requiring incredible ingenuity and organization, but achievable by the Egyptians of that time.
Absolutely. When you piece together the evidence from archaeology, from texts, from the monuments themselves, it tells a story of human capability, not extraterrestrials or mythical forces. The people of the Fourth Dynasty and later periods really did this.
So maybe a final thought for you listening. As you picture those amazing pyramids against the sky, think about that legacy. How does knowing the sheer human effort involved change how we see them? And how does it make you think about that incredible drive humans have across cultures and time to build something truly monumental, something lasting? What other deep dives into history might show us similar, unexpected levels of complexity and human ingenuity?
It makes you wonder what else is waiting to be fully understood.
It really does. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.